Chapter 5, verses 1 through 12. Now listen, you rich people. Weep and wail because of the misery that is coming upon you. Your wealth has rotted, and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. You have hoarded wealth in the last days. Look, the wages you failed to pay the workmen who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. You have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered innocent men who are not opposing you. Be patient then, brothers, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, and how patient he is for the autumn and spring rains. You too, be patient and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. Don't grumble against each other, brothers, or you will be judged. The judge is standing at the door. Brothers, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. As you know, we considered blessed those who have persevered. You have heard Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. Above all, my brothers, do not swear, not by heaven or by earth or by anything else. Let your yes be yes, and your no, no, or you will be condemned. The word of the Lord.
Thank you, Sue. Children are dismissed if they'd like to head out to Children's Church. We're going to look this morning at this passage in James, friends, that is probably one of the most difficult to interpret, most difficult to stomach in the whole letter. I mean, James talks about the need to weep and wail because misery is coming upon us. It describes us as being a people ready for the day of slaughter. These are not nice words that James is about to use. He's been tap dancing on toes up until this point. Today he intends to squish a few. This is not going to be necessarily an easy or fun passage to look at, but it is one that's very important. What we're going to watch James do, and what we have to remember he has been doing, is that James is absolutely convinced that the gospel of Jesus Christ, that the further we go into the gospel, the more we know the heart of our God, friends, the more that we who are broken image bearers, people who reflect our God and the way he thinks and speaks and feels and reacts and interacts brokenly, that the more we get the gospel in us, the more we begin to look like him and act like him and think like him and react like him. And I don't know if you've caught on or not, but James does not believe there's a single area of our life that the gospel of Jesus Christ does not get to touch and transform. And that includes money. It includes our idea of what is comfortable and our willingness to be uncomfortable. See, James is going to talk to two groups, two Christian groups, right? Two groups of people that are present in every single church. And I think it's probably more like a Venn diagram. We're going to talk about two groups, but for most of us, there's overlap, at least in America. The first group that he's going to talk to, and that's the first 6 verses there, are Christians who are very comfortable in this world. Right? Our needs are met plus. We are comfortable financially. We are doing okay. And the world's looking all right. Now, almost every person in America is comfortable, friends. Even those of us who whine and complain that we don't have enough money. Now, I went to Haiti several years ago, and I have decided after then, I don't get to complain. I'm pretty comfortable, and so are most of us. James is also going to talk to a group of people, and there's some overlap, folks who are uncomfortable. Christians are uncomfortable in this world. And in part, he's talking to individuals who money is an issue. There's not enough even for basic needs. But he's also talking to people who are uncomfortable in this world because there's suffering and there's pain And that's why sometimes there's overlap. You can be very comfortable financially and still be incredibly uncomfortable because there's suffering that's present in your life. And to both of these groups, James is going to say, if we will look past this world, something remarkable will happen. That those of us who are very comfortable, if we will look and to the next, we will look to the when Jesus is going to return, that we will suddenly discover that we are far more willing to be uncomfortable. And those of us who are uncomfortable right now, as we look to eternity, discover comfort that's present even in this moment. And I'll tell you from the get-go, we're going to spend most of our time talking to comfortable Christians because I think that's where most of us land. So let's dive into what James has to say. James opens this passage for us by giving us kind of a diagnosis, so to speak, a description of what comfortable Christians look like. And if you're going to put it in a nutshell, it's this. For comfortable Christians, money matters the most and people matter the least. Listen to what he says. He says, now listen, you rich people. Now listen, weep and wail because of the misery that's coming upon you. Your wealth has rotted and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and your silver, they are corroded. Their corrosion is going to testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. You have hoarded wealth in the last days. And then if you jump down to verse 5, it says, you have lived on earth in luxury and in self-indulgence. Now let's just pause there for a second. Now, lest we think even for one quick second when we read this that James is not talking to you and I. Sometimes people read this and they say James is using very, very strong language. He's talking to the mean rich people who run corporations who we really hate out there. But James uses the exact same sentence structure in chapter 5, verse 1 as he did last week in chapter 4, verse 13. And last week, we did not think he was talking to practical atheists who weren't Christians. He was talking to us. And James is saying here to Christians, he says, here's the deal. You love money a lot. And he says, here's the proof that money matters most to us, that money matters so much to us, is in the evidence that we hoard it. Now, we talked last week, friends, that the Lord is not bothered by you and I saving for the necessities of tomorrow. I think it is absolutely important and necessary that we do that. But James is talking to people, to Christians, who've crossed the line, right? From saving for tomorrow, for the necessities that are needed, to hoarding for luxuries so I can indulge. And you know the difference. We all know about hoarding. We learned about it last year. Remember? Right? Like if we're going to use this and we're going to use toilet paper as the comparison, there is nothing wrong with you and I having a nice big container of Charmin somewhere in the house. It's there for when you need it. But there comes a moment where we no longer need it. Where at this point it's called just hoarding. And the thing about hoarding, and we all learned this when we went to the stores, if you were like me and you didn't go early enough, and you got to the store when you needed it and went, uh-oh. Because the thing about hoarding is that what it means is instead of taking what I need, I take what I need and what you need and what you need and a bunch of other people need. And I hoard it for myself. So when James is speaking to us, to believers, he's calling us out for that attitude. He says, hey, Christians, sometimes we look like the rest of the world. And we look at our money, and instead of saying, I'm going to save enough for my needs and enough for my necessities, we start to hoard. So I have enough for what I need, but I also have what you need. And I'm intending to keep it, because that means I have not just what I need, but I also have the luxuries and the indulgences that I want as well. And the reason that I want to hoard it is because money matters most. And people matter the least. So in his context, the example that James gave his people from their lives, as he says, verse 4, look, the wages that you failed to pay the workmen who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. I don't think James pulled that one out of thin air. I think James is saying, no, for real, that's what you're doing. That he had people in his congregation who were rich enough that they could pay someone else to mow their fields. But when it came the end of the workday and it was time to pay, they looked at those workers and said, if I pay you, I got to eat into my hoard. If I pay you, then what I will have won't be as much as what I want. So rather than sacrifice and scrimp, they just said no. And in James's culture, friends, day laborers needed to be paid every day. When Jesus said, pray for our daily bread, we pray that today, and we're like, that's such a lovely, quaint phrase. I don't have daily bread. I can go to the grocery store and have a year's worth of bread if I so desire. But they got paid that day to put food on the table that day. So if someone looked at them who owed them money and said, you know what, I just don't think I can afford it, then that person didn't eat, and neither did their family, because they were going on the toilet paper principle. Now, I think it would be really easy to read this passage and assume that James is talking to not you and not me. That he's talking to someone who's very, very, very filthy rich and very mean about it. And I can picture people like that. I bet you can too. I had a guy at my last church, that man was filthy rich. And anytime you came to him and said, hey, this person has a need, and I know you could meet it, and like you wouldn't have to blink, he would stand back and say, well, then they should have worked harder. Like, cool, dude. By the way, he died alone in a room that was filled with all kinds of art and literally millions of dollars worth of art, and not a soul around. But I don't think that's who James is primarily targeting. I think he's targeting me. And I'm not that rich. Because it is so easy to fall into this trap, isn't it? Here, think about it for a moment. This will not work for the teenagers in the room, but I assure you a day will come where this will make sense. For the rest of you, think about your first paycheck. Right? Not the first paycheck you got like babysitting, but your first like big boy and big girl job. Okay? I'm guessing your first paycheck was like down here on the scale, I hope, of how much you ended up making. But you remember the first one? First paycheck and your first standard of living. Remember this one? My very first apartment was outfitted by all of the junk my mother found at other people's yard sales. You know, the stuff they didn't want in their house anymore was now in my house. And I was real proud of it. Then I made a little bit more money. And do you know what happened with my standard of living? It matched. I got rid of the junk from I sold it at a yard sale. And it went to some other poor schmuck. And I went to the store and bought actual furniture. And a car that could run. It was pretty sweet. And I had all my needs met, plus some. And then my standard of living went up a little bit, my income went up a little bit more. Do you know what my standard of living did? Oh, right. And it keeps going, doesn't it? Some of us are pretty good about saving our money. So as our income goes up, maybe our standard of living will stay the same, but we just take the difference, right, the money that remains, and we put it away in savings. And that's not a bad thing. I need to put it away in savings. I need to make sure I can take care of tomorrow, that if something happens, I can meet the bills and pay for the necessities. And so I did that, and I got it in savings. And then I thought, but is that enough? Maybe I need more. And my income went up, and I kept putting more and more and more money away, and I'm still doing it. And at a certain point, I crossed a line where I went from I'm saving for necessities to I'm hoarding for my luxuries. And you know when I can tell? It's when I start looking at the money and then I look at a person. And sometimes it's exactly the way that James described it here. Like, if you owe somebody money right now, because that's the situation that James gave, you owe somebody money, you got a loan from somebody, and you look at them, and you right now at this moment are paying nothing or the minimum amount because you don't want to sacrifice and scrimp and live just a little bit less so they get what you actually owe them, then you've probably reached a point where you've said, I'd rather hoard then provide this person what they need. Or somebody will come and a need will be presented before me, and I know I have enough money to be able to take care of what this other person needs. And everything within me goes, but if I do that, my vacation won't be as nice. If I do that, then the little project I want to do around the house that is not a necessity is more cosmetic, but I want it. I can't afford it this year. Now, maybe that doesn't happen in your world, but it happens in mine, where I find myself a very comfortable Christian. I like my comfort. And so I hoard my money so that I always have enough for my luxuries. Now, here's the deal. I cannot tell you where that line is. You're going to have to ask the Lord where the line is for you. And then when he tells you, obey. I do know that it is utterly impossible for a Christian to remain true to the Lord and true to his word and live at the same standard of living as your income. That cannot happen. Now, Christians also ought not to be living at a standard of living that is above your income. At the very least, 10% goes back to the Lord, right? 10% in the tithe that I give him through his church, which means a Christian can never have a standard of living that matches their income. But my guess is that for most of us, we could go even further than that. But you know what'll change it? What makes me, as a comfortable Christian, willing to be uncomfortable? I look to what's coming. See, I think what James is trying to do in this passage, friend, is get us comfortable with being uncomfortable in this lifetime. And the way he does it is he says if we stay comfortable, money mattering the most and people mattering the least, then when Christ returns, we're going to be very uncomfortable. See, James says a couple things, friends. First one he says is that the judge, he's coming back. Now, one day Jesus is going to return. And when he returns, he said in verse 2 that my wealth that I have hoarded is going to rot in front of Jesus. And when it rots in front of Jesus, it will be the proof and evidence to my judge that I loved that money more than I loved him. Or I loved that money more than I loved the people, the neighbors he put in my life. And that's going to be an uncomfortable moment. He says on that same day that the wages that I haven't paid out, right, the moments when I looked at people and said, I will not scrimp for you. I'm going to hoard for me. He says those wages and the cries of those people who I exploited are going to raise up before the judge, and I'm going to be judged. Now, I don't think that James is saying if I, as a comfortable Christian in this world, that I will lose my salvation. I do think he's saying I will be held accountable. And not only is the judge coming, but here's the deal, friends. This life is not the end. James uses a really ironic statement in verse 5. He says, you've lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter. That's not a pretty term. Now, I don't know how many of you grew up in the country. But across the street from where I grew up, actually three sides of my house were cow pastures. And you know what live in a cow pasture? Cows. Come on, people. Cows don't have a whole lot going for them, friends, but their owners have one job and one desire is to fatten that cow up. Get Bessie nice and good and fat. Because do you know what happens at the end of Bessie's life? Bessie gets slaughtered, and Bessie becomes a very tasty dinner. Now, that's all she's ever going to be. James uses really ironic language. He says, you and I, we live in this luxury and self-indulgence and as comfortable as we can possibly be in this world. We're living like this world is it. So get fattened up. But this world isn't the end. If you're a Christian, you know that. You know that you have a far greater life to which you are called, one that will be far greater, richer than anything this world could ever hold. So maybe, just maybe, it's worth it slimming down, tightening a belt in order to bless others. Because this world isn't the end. Do you want to know what changes us? It's not leave here today feeling guilty and shamed and try to do better. It's the same thing it always is. The one thing that always ever changes me is I look at Jesus. Verse 6 is a weird verse in the original language, and it almost never gets translated the way it's actually written because it doesn't make a lot of sense. But if you read it in its original language, it says, "You have condemned and you have murdered the innocent one who does not oppose you." You've condemned and murdered the one person, the one man who is innocent, and he isn't opposing you. Most of your English translations change it up. They make it plural, like you're robbing the poor and they're dying because of your actions. But that's not what James said. What James says is that you and I, in our actions, when we hoard, when we say that money matters more than people, that we condemn and we murder the only one who is innocent. You might remember that at the end of the book of Matthew, Matthew 25, Jesus tells a parable. And in the parable, Jesus says that whatever you have done to the least of these, whatever you have done to the people who in this world are most uncomfortable, you do to him. So Jesus says, if you feed the poor and you clothe the naked and you care for the sick, that when you do that to a person who's right here, you invest your resources in that person, it's like you're doing it to Jesus. And he also says in the same parable, and when you refuse to feed the person who is hungry, you refuse to clothe the person who is naked, then you refuse to do it to him. And I wonder if that's what James has in the back of his mind. Where he says, when I decide that money matters so much and people matter so little, that every time I exploit somebody, whether I do it directly to their face or I just go to the store and say, I'm going to buy the cheapest coffee that there is, even though I know that it's cheap because somebody isn't being paid a living wage. That every time I do that, I do it to the innocent one. I think if I started to look at people differently and see what I was doing it to Jesus, suddenly I'd be willing to be uncomfortable. You know, if I was willing to say this life isn't the end, so if I give up a few luxuries now, but I'm going to spend eternity in the presence of my God, it's okay. And if I was willing to say one day the judge is coming and what I want to hear him say is, you did so well, faithful servant, with the resources I gave you, not stand beside the rotting pile of my hoarded money and say, why? If you and I started to look in the face of Jesus Christ and say, Jesus, every time I have a little less for me because there's more to invest in somebody else, I do it to you, I think my heart would change. And here's the amazing part of that verse. James says, I do condemn and murder Jesus when I hoard and I refuse to use my resources in the lives of other people. But he also says Jesus doesn't oppose me. Jesus is not, in this moment, standing here ready to condemn. He's standing the way he always stands, ready to forgive, ready to show mercy, and ready to show grace. So frankly, that means if you've done this same pattern for decades, and you start new today, Jesus is still ready. If you're a comfortable Christian today, you are very comfortable in this world, then the invitation before you is to look to tomorrow and be willing to be uncomfortable today. What exactly that's going to mean for your finances, I don't get to tell you. But I bet if you sat down with Jesus, he can open doors and show you what that would mean. But some of us in the room today, we're uncomfortable. We're talking about uncomfortable Christians today. What we mean is folks for whom money matters. Because some of us here, we don't have our basic needs met. So frankly, we're not too worried about hoarding money. And for others, what being an uncomfortable Christian means is maybe you're the ones you feel like you matter the least. Maybe you feel like you're the one who's being exploited. Somebody else is taking advantage of you in the way that James said people in his church, the rich, were taking advantage of the poor. Maybe you're uncomfortable because there's suffering, very real, serious suffering in your world right now, and you just want it to end. To uncomfortable Christians, James is going to say, the same thing. Because the first thing he's going to say to those of us who are uncomfortable is that you can gain comfort by recognizing that the judge is coming. Verse 7 says, "Be patient, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, how patient he is for the autumn and the spring rains. You too, be patient, stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. Don't grumble against each other, brothers or sisters, or you'll be judged. The judge is standing at the door." Sometimes I forget that. And sometimes I think we walk, uncomfortable Christians, we walk through this life and we see injustice, we see people being treated poorly, and we're the ones. Or we're walking through incredible suffering in this season and we just want things made right. Sometimes you sit down with folks and you say, we went to the same schools, we got the same background, how come their world looks so different than mine? But if you're a Christian today, even if you're facing a very uncomfortable moment in life, you get to be reminded of this. Your judge, he is coming. James says that Jesus is standing at the door, that the judge is coming quickly and swiftly, and when he comes, he will make all things right. For comfortable Christians, that's scary. But for uncomfortable Christians, that's a promise with amazing reward. See, when he comes, friends, everything in this world that's ever been wrong, every place that you just desperately desire there to be vindication, he's going to bring. That's the first thing. You look into the eternity and you're uncomfortable today, the judge is coming, and he's going to make everything wrong right. Second thing, this isn't the end. Brothers and sisters, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Do you ever actually pay attention to the prophets? Like their lives? Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. How about Jesus? He is the ultimate prophet. All of them were sent by the Lord for a work in this world. They were sent to proclaim the truth of God, and every last one of them suffered unbelievably. People ignored them. People didn't believe them. They faced horrible deaths, and they didn't stop doing what they were doing because they knew this life isn't the end. That they could have untold suffering, but a day would come when there would be no more. As you know, he says in verse 11, we consider blessed those who have persevered. Now, you've heard of Job's perseverance. You've seen what the Lord finally brought about. The Lord is full of compassion, and the Lord is full of mercy. Some of you today resonate with Job's story. Job started out very comfortable in this world. He had all the money you could ever want. He had health. He had a huge family. And then in Job chapter 1, he loses everything. He loses all the wealth. He loses all 10 of his children and is left with a very unpleasant wife. He loses his health. He loses his friends. He loses his purpose. He loses his standing. Job loses everything. And yet, Job persevered. Job remained faithful. Do you know why? Because suffering wasn't his end. Suffering is never your end if you know Jesus Christ. In Job's case, if you've read the last chapter of his story, you know that God gave him a new family. He restored his wealth plus. But even if God hadn't given Job the final chapter, suffering still wouldn't have been his end. If Job had died penniless and no one with him except his nagging wife, suffering wouldn't have been his end. Because this life is not the end. Which means that whatever suffering you're facing today, it's not your end. That's why there's comfort in the gospel. So do the same thing that Job did. Look at Christ. There's this amazing sentence in the book of Job, chapter 19. If you know Job's story, you know that after he loses everything, he comes at God and he says, I want a judge. I want the judge to show up. I want the judge to come and tell me what I did wrong that this happened. And he says over and over and over again, I want to be vindicated. I want God to come and answer my questions. He never loses faith because Job knows something amazing. Job 19, verse 25, he says, I know that my Redeemer lives and that in the end, My Redeemer will stand upon the earth. And after my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh I will see God. I myself will see him. I'll see him with my own eyes. I and not another. How my heart yearns within me. Job walked through horrendous suffering, friends. And he looked with eyes of faith, and he knew the day would come when he would see Jesus face to face, when he would stand on the earth and he would see Jesus. And every question would be answered and every wrong made right. And if you are an uncomfortable Christian right now, the world is very painful for you in this moment, then you need to know your judge will make it right. That suffering is not your end. And that in this day, you get to fix your eyes on Jesus. Because you will see him one day face to face. And that, friend, is where comfort lies. If you're a comfortable Christian today, your invitation is to be uncomfortable. And if today you're an uncomfortable Christian, to know because Christ is returning, what comfort looks like in this moment. Let's pray together. As we come before the Lord today, if you need to ask God to make you uncomfortable and confess that you've been very comfortable, then come and do so. And if today you need to come before the Lord and say, God, I am incredibly uncomfortable. I need to know the comfort that is mine and the hope of tomorrow, then invite him to give that to you. Father, I thank you for the truth that wherever we are in our walk, whatever life looks like, the hope of eternity and the promise of the gospel always speaks, always changes, always gives us a different perspective. Today, may we be found a people who respond to that truth, who don't live, like we talked about last week, like practical atheists, but as those who know that the judge is coming and this isn't our end. And as our eyes are fixed on you, Jesus, may we be transformed today. Jesus, we pray these things in your name. Amen.